Welcome to episode 42 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about that, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's episode, we'll cover roughly lines 358 through line 444 from the Latin text, and we'll discuss how the mind works through the senses, how the mind is a relatively small part of the body, and how the mind has more power than the spirit, but that both the mind and spirit are mortal. Now let's join the discussion with Elaine reading today's text.
To say likewise that the eyes can see nothing of themselves, but the mind looks through them as through doors laid open, this is ridiculous, when sense itself tells them the contrary and sets it full in their view, especially when we are unable to look upon objects that dazzle the eyes, because our sight is confounded by too great a lustre. This could not be if they were mere doors, nor are open doors that we look through capable of pain. Besides, if our eyes were no more than doors, the mind would see clearer when the eyes were pulled out and the whole frame taken away. In this case, it is vain to take shelter under the sacred opinion of Democritus, who says that as many parts as there are of the body, so many parts too of the soul are answerable and contained in them. For since the principles of the soul are not only much smaller than those of which the body and its parts consist, but are fewer in number and are spread thinly in distant spaces all over the limbs, you may affirm so far that the principles of the soul take up only so many different spaces and intervals as may be sufficient for those little seeds that are in us to incite those motions that produce sensation. That this sense does not affect every minute part of the body is plain, for we seldom feel the dust that sticks upon us, nor the particles of chalk that drop upon our limbs, nor do we perceive the dew by night, or the fine threads of the spider meeting us when we are entangled by the subtle net as we pass along, nor the decaying web lighting upon our heads, nor are we sensible of the soft feathers of birds, nor of the flying down of thistles, which from their natural levity are scarce able to descend upon us, nor do we feel the motion of every creeping insect, nor the little traces of the feet which gnats and such animals make upon us. So that the many seeds which are diffused over all the limbs must be first put into motion before the principles of the soul are agitated and made capable to feel. And before its seeds, by striking upon each other through so many distant spaces, can meet, unite, and part again, and be so variously moved as to produce sense and perception in us. But the mind it is that keeps up the defenses of life, and has a more sovereign power to preserve our beings than all the faculties of the soul. For without the mind, the least part of the soul cannot secure its residence in the body for a moment, but follows it readily as a close companion, and vanishes into air along with it, and leaves the cold limbs in the frozen arms of death. But the man whose mind is whole and entire remains alive, though he be mangled and all his limbs lopped off. Yet his trunk, though his soul be so far gone and his members separated from him, still lives and breathes the vital air. The trunk, if not spoiled of the whole, yet of a great part of the soul, still continues alive and holds fast its being. So if you tear the eye all round, if the pupil remains safe, the power of sight continues entire, so long as you do no injury to the apple, but cut the white all around and leave that whole. This may be done without any danger or loss to the sight. But if ever so little of the middle of the eye be pricked through, though the ball otherwise looks bright and sound, the light instantly dies away and darkness follows. This is the case of the mind and soul, and by such bonds are they always held together. And now for your sake, my Memmius, and to let you know that the mind and soul are born in us and die with us, I will go on to write lines worthy of thy genius, and which I have been long preparing, and have at last by sweet labor happily perfected. Observe only that you apply both names indifferently or more plainly when I offered to say the soul is mortal. You are to understand, I mean the mind likewise, since they are both so united together that in this respect they make but one and the same thing. First, then, since I have proved that the soul consists of very minute seeds, and is formed of principles much less than clear water, or mist, or smoke, because it is more apt to move, and is set a-going by a much lighter stroke, for it is moved by the very images of mist and smoke. As when by sleep overcome, in dreams we see the lofty altars exhale a vapor, and send up smoke into the air, the images of these things no doubt produce these phantasms in us. And since, you see, when the vessel is broken to pieces, the water breaks loose and flows away in a stream, and since mist and smoke vanish into air, conclude the soul likewise to be poured out, and that its principles much sooner perish, and its seeds are more easily dissolved, when it is separated and retires from all the limbs. For since the body, which is, as it were, a vessel to it, when it is bruised to pieces by an outward force, or rarefied by the blood being drawn out of the veins, cannot keep it in, how can you suppose it can be contained by subtle air? How can that which is more rare than this body of ours preserve it entire?
Elaine, thanks for reading all that. Maybe we should give Elaine a break and Martin and Charles jump in first with commentary. Do you guys have comments so far?
Not directly on the first paragraph.
Martin, you with us?
Yes, I listened. I'm thinking of what to say about it.
There's a lot to take in.
Well, he starts, it's very catching about how if we would see clearer if the eyes were pulled out and the whole frame taken away, but we know that's not true, presumably. So, but what's the point of that?
I think this, because where it's placed, where he goes on to talk about the soul, that, okay, it's hard for me to separate my modern understanding from this, because I mean, the eyes are sense organs. They're not just doors. So we need our brains. We need our sensory cortex. So if we block infants' sight at birth, like baby animals, we block their sight from birth. There's the critical window of development of visual cortex in the brain, which I'm thinking he would call as part of the mind. Then even if you remove the blindfold to the eyes, there's no vision. The visual cortex didn't develop. It depended on the sense organs to go through that critical part of development. So you've got to, I guess I'm trying to say, you've got to have both parts. You got to have the mind and the sense organ. So the eyes aren't just, it's just not that there's just a hole there and the mind is seeing through the hole. The sense organs are participating in the ability to see. Now, I don't think he's gone that far, but what he said is close enough to how are we thinking about it now. It's real interesting, him trying to sort these things out.
It's almost like he's calling out people who discredit sensory perception. And so he's kind of making a buffed up analogy, like sarcasm.
Yeah. Like the eyes are not just this inert things. They're not inactive. They're actually senses and what we would call sense organs.
I would add here that he clearly is calling out somebody, and I was just recently editing our podcast from last week, and what I'm reminded of right now that I finally absorbed some of it, is something that Elaine said last week when we were discussing the issue of free will and how the religious view of free will, that there is some kind of an autonomous entity within your body that inhabits it potentially from the outside, is not true. That's certainly not the Epicurean perspective. And so maybe that's what he's talking about here when he says that the eyes can see nothing of themselves, but the mind looks through them as through doors laid open. Maybe he is emphasizing the incorrect view. He's saying the mind is not some autonomous force locked within the body that somehow looks out through the body to experience reality. He's saying something very different than that.
I agree. This next section... go ahead. Sorry, Martin.
Elaine, coming back to the experiment you described. So if these animals who have been blinded at the critical stage, then later the blind is removed, do they at least develop reaction to bright and dark?
I'd have to go back and look at the experiments, but I'm pretty sure that if you totally miss that period of the visual cortex development, that they're actually blind.
Yeah, I mean, this is when I could understand that they cannot, they don't know how to make sense out of the images the retina receives, so they cannot distinguish things, but they should at least be able to react to bright and dark.
Well, but the visual cortex is necessary for that also. So you have pupillary reactions to light. Mm-hmm. So peripherally you can, and then depending on how bad the cortical blindness is, you may be able to have some experience of seeing things, but really the brain, the visual cortex is still necessary even to have the experience of light and dark. So there's some that is a complicated area of science. There's some experiments that suggest that some people who are totally blind might be able to perceive light, but in a non-visual way. So they're not experiencing it anything like the way that we're thinking of. So it would kind of be hard to make analogies, but you need both your cortex and your peripheral sense organ to have all of the parts of vision. It just kind of depends on how badly things are disrupted.
Yeah, I mean, that's easy to imagine. No? So if you mix up the pixels of an image, you do not see that. And if this cortex isn't developed, then it's understandable. It cannot put things together to make a meaningful image.
So I think what you're talking about actually is closer to, and I'll look this up and make sure I'm just not totally off base because it's been a while since I've looked at this, but that would be the case for people who have hearing loss from birth, and then let's say they get an implant to be able to a cochlear implant to be able to hear. They have trouble. Sound is kind of messy. It's very messy. It's hard to pick things out. I believe I'm remembering correctly that you can deprive animals of vision if you do it from the very beginning, such that it's not clear if they can perceive anything visually, even if you restore their sight. But it would probably depend on the animal, because even in utero, there's some perception depending on like their gestational length of light, like even through the tissue. So then that would have stimulated some visual cortex development. But if you, like, let's say you remove the visual cortex, you're not going to be able to perceive light and dark. So the experience of seeing definitely requires the brain, not just the eye.
Mm-hmm. I know we try to put that in context. I think Elaine was suggesting earlier that we could look into the next paragraph about where it talks about Democritus.
So so that one really, that is all of his observations about our tactile senses are so interesting. This is one of those times where I feel like he would have been super excited if he saw the research that's available now about the different parts of the peripheral nervous system, light touch and pressure and 2-point discrimination. He's noticing the phenomena that research explains, why we can feel certain amounts of touch and not others. But it does really sound like what he's describing as the soul we would now call the peripheral nervous system.
Does anybody have a comment on where the argument is going there in that next section? Because it's really focused, as Elaine's talking about, on what we might call as the nervous system. I also think, though, he's really just listing examples of why he thinks that the particles of the soul are fewer and farther between than other types of particles in the body. What's the implication of that?
I don't have an exact answer to that, but after he lists all the examples in the second paragraph, the last sentence he concludes with is pretty interesting. Here, I'll just repeat it. So that the many seeds which are diffused over all the limbs must first put into motion before the principles of the soul are agitated and made capable to feel. And then he continues on. I thought something interesting from that was, at least my interpretation of it, of what he was exactly saying, was that like the principles of matter being able to collide and interact with each other preceded something more sophisticated like a soul or, the mind and a nervous system.
I'm thinking Elaine is going to say something to that.
Where he talks about things being like the soul being spread out, he is using observations about what we can feel with our tactile sense and what we can't to conclude that these particles have to be spread out. So today we would say the peripheral nerve endings are spread out and they're denser in some parts of the body than others. I don't see that he noticed that, but I mean, he's the general direction that his observations are leading him to conclude is almost right, but it's just that they're not particles. I mean, it was really pretty brilliant to be able to notice that. Even though he didn't get it exactly right, that's just amazing. I guess I'm just, y'all are trying to figure out where he's going with it, but I'm just super impressed with the level of observation that he's made about so many parts of nature in the detail. And he's trying to make all these things fit together.
It's definitely a multi-track conversation that we have going on here through a lot of these podcasts. So we need to kind of keep that in mind, is that there's valid observations to be made on several levels of things, and we don't always hit every level like we probably could or should, and we just have to hit the ones that seem most impactful to us at the moment. But definitely there's different levels of analysis here. And before we go on, what Charles said a minute ago has rung in my mind when he's talking about the particles must first be put into motion before the principles of the soul are agitated. Charles was commenting on that. And that reminds me that there are several sections in, I think, later aspects of Lucretius. I'm remembering an exchange between Cicero and Cassius Longinus when I think Cicero was almost kind of joking with Cassius about the images, and in that passage Cicero was calling them specters. But there's apparently this line of thought within some of this material that a lot of our thoughts arise because of these images coming through the air and us receiving them. And Cicero was saying, well, you thought of me because my image floated to your mind or something. And it's kind of a joking way or sarcastic way in that exchange. And then Cassius responded that, well, you may think that that's ridiculous, but I can hit you with a bunch of Stoic Boerisms that will be much more ridiculous than that. And unfortunately, they don't continue the conversation much further than that. But as we go forward, the idea that these images are constantly flying through the air and that our minds are at times having their attention called to particular images, and that leads us to particular thoughts and particular emotions. I have no comment or way to analyze it really, other than that it's there in the material, and interesting to think about whether it has any validity and what they were thinking about, all sorts of aspects of it. But it's there in the material to consider.
This is way off topic. Consider this more of thinking out loud, but I wonder if the images have some sort of similarities with George Berkeley's immaterialism.
I have no knowledge of George Berkeley or his immaterialism. Yes,
right.
I mean, there'd be some very, very obvious upfront contradictions there, but I wonder if that's worth looking into. I'll look into that after I read the reverence and awe thread after this.
Charles, you've also reminded me that back when Lucretius first introduced the idea of the swerve and the free will, if I'm remembering correctly, there was a discussion of how racehorses, they're straining, and something about how thought arises in the mind that they wish to jump forward, but it takes some time for the motion of the particles from the mind to get to the legs and so forth. I think there's an aspect of that as well here, that the particles that we're talking about of sense are going through the body, and they just don't all instantly occur as sort of as a divine thing. There's a chain event of particles moving around to create the result. Okay, that was inarticulately expressed by me, so let's move to something we can be more articulate about. Because the next paragraph or section that we're looking up is talking about that the mind is more of a sovereign power to preserve our beings than all the faculties of the soul. Now, you get to the difference between anima and animus, and we have a distinction here that's difficult to really understand. So anybody want to try to tackle what he's trying to say when he is emphasizing the power of the mind over this other faculty?
Not quite that, but I want to know what experiments were done to draw the conclusions about cutting into eyes.
I want to say this. I always think about this. I had LASIK eye surgery done to my eyes. I don't know if any of you guys had LASIK or not. But I remember it was amazing to me that when I was under the knife or the laser or whatever, or under the knife, because they first peel back the flap of of some part of your eye, and it just went totally black. Even though I knew that I was staring into this light, it went totally black, which I still don't particularly understand. But I relate that experience to what he's saying here about how it can go black, which is not intuitive to me at all. It would seem like you'd experience just a white light fog. But in my case, when they lifted the flap of my LASIK, it just went black. So.
Interesting. Huh.
Did you have a comment on that, Elaine? Did you think that he was talking about something particular there?
This is just more that makes me think of the peripheral and the central nervous system, that the mind that keeps the brain does coordinate everything. It has the sovereign power to preserve our beings, and that without the brain, the peripheral nervous system can't manage it. Well, he's not saying that, but it's similar. What he's calling the soul can't hold together without the mind. And as long as you've got your mind, even if you don't have your arms and legs, that you can obviously still think and are still alive. You still got your heart, and your lungs, which he's calling the trunk. But he says there's still the soul that's left in that part, which he's seeing as the core. And then he's thinking of the eye as having this central part. I mean, obviously you can't totally screw up the globe. I mean, he doesn't, I guess, know about the retina and the different parts of the eyes that we do. You can't tear up the eye and just leave the pupil and still be able to see. But he must have looked at people that have had some injuries, like maybe they had pink eye or something like that, or some kind of peripheral injury to the eye, and then could still see.
Somebody took an arrow to the head.
Yeah. So I'm sure he's basing these ideas on some sorts of observations that he's made. And when he says the middle, I mean, is he only talking about the pupil, leaving the hole, or actually the center of the globe of the eye where with the vitreous and the retina and the lens? I don't know. So
I wouldn't quite say it's off topic, but it's just another thought that this is definitely the second, but maybe even the third time he's brought up how limbs being cut off don't completely deteriorate the soul, like it doesn't leak out of the body.
Right.
But he does mention that part of it is gone by doing that. Like if your arms and legs are gone. And I wonder if that is supported in his view by the fact that, well, a lot of cultures, and I can't come up with any specifics in mind in terms of Rome or like Roman views, but if the soul was tied to the chest or located in the chest, and that's why if you only have a torso and a head, you'll be fine.
Oh, interesting. Yes, I mean, because it's particulate in his mind, you would have parts of it missing if you cut off parts of the body, because whatever those particles wouldn't be there anymore, but you have enough left in your trunk to say you still have some soul in there.
Martin, if you don't have anything, that's going to take us to the final of our 4 paragraphs for today, where he addresses Memmius and says basically his conclusion, which is that the mind and the soul are born in us and die with us. And so that's probably where he's been leading with a lot of this anyway. He's now explicitly stating it in this final section we have for today.
Yeah, Martin, you say something first about this.
Moment, first I need to think what to say. Yeah, the interesting part is I would also rather consider now rather that mind and soul are one and the same thing.
Yes.
Because they're so united together.
Yes,
yeah.
So it's somehow artificial to really split that.
There are, even if they are two things that you can talk about, they're so connected that one can't exist without the other, and so you might as well call them united. And again, that goes with the idea of the nervous system. I mean, what would a brain in a vat be able to do? Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you've got to have both the peripheral and the central nervous system to be alive, What do you think about this part where he says, in dreams, we see the lofty altars exhale a vapor instead of smoke in the air? The images of these things no doubt produce these phantasms in us.
Yes. That's interesting. That's one of many references to images, just how we are affected by images coming through the air. We probably won't go off and should not go off today into a long discussion of images of the gods and things like that. But
we'll
clearly there is a line. Yeah, so we're going to get a lot more.
He is not thinking that dreams are based on memory and imagination, but are actual
clearly
perception.
Yes, Elaine, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So, and that's
there is
counter
a lot of
to
that.
our modern understanding of dreams. But so we'll be interested to get to the part where he talks about memories and imagining about the future. How would those mental images be different from dreams? That's all kind of bookmark that in my mind. That does he do you remember, does he get to that, how that happens?
Absolutely, Elaine, absolutely. That's a very good comment, because I'm going to be very interested in your comments as we go through, because in my recollection of reading through Lucretius in the past, there's discussion about how memories of good things in the past help us enjoy the present.
Yes,
but there's not a lot of this. But there's not a lot of specific discussion about memory itself that I recall.
About how physiologically we see
there's not
these things that were in the past. Yeah. Or how can we imagine things that are in the future and kind of have a visual idea of them,
In fact, it's really strange, because in fact there does seem to be a lot more discussion of these images continuously floating through the air and continuously striking us and continuously sort of inspiring our thoughts than there seems to be that we're storing it in some part of our brain and then calling it up in the future. There's much more discussion of the image thing now, and it may be that is because of the parts that are preserved, and because images, I think, were something that he seems to have considered almost like touching and feeling and seeing things. I mean, when he talks about seeing something, it's hard for me to distinguish that he's the process of seeing a tree seems to involve for him atoms from the tree traveling through the air and striking our eyes and coming into our minds in that way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So,
he didn't have access to research about light, so.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure that I understand how light is different than that, frankly. I'm kind of still thinking, is that not true, that light is traveling from the tree to our eyes, right? There is a particle or wave that travels to us, right?
Yeah, but for him, it sounded like the tree itself was sending the image somehow.
Yes.
So it's a small difference.
There's a tiny sense in Laertius on Epicurus. Towards the end, it talks a bit about this, because I've looked before into images with their connections to dreams, and there's not a lot. There's only this, I think, like a sentence from Plutarch, and then we just have the stuff from Lucretius in Book 4. But it says here that, and the visions of the insane and those in dreams are true, for they cause movement, and that which does not exist cannot cause movement. And so it's probably what we're trying to grasp at, the concept.
He didn't think there was movement unless it had been produced by something from the outside, which that's not how we think things are happening now, like in our imagination, and when we imagine the future that's never happened.
No, see, Lane, the way you said that might be a little too extreme when you said that he doesn't think that there's anything unless it's caused by movement from the outside. I don't know that he has eliminated the possibility of movement within the brain, but clearly there's a lot of it going on that's caused by movement from the outside that we don't seem to
right. He hasn't necessarily said it.
Probably.
It isn't, but he infers that there must be movement, like in these dreams, the altar. So he might go in that direction, but you're right. He hasn't said it 100%, but he seems to lean that way.
It sounds paradoxical just by saying it out loud, but I wonder if, like, an Epicurean or somebody who's blind would be able to receive these images in the same way.
Interesting.
Which images are you talking about, Mark?
Like the altars.
That's the talk about the images of the gods, which I think clearly there are passages which seem to imply that the images of the gods do not come through the eyes.
Right.
That there are passages that DeWitt points to that somehow, I've used the word already today, that the mind is some kind of a suprasensory organism, or let's put it this way, that the mind can somehow directly receive images. Now, see, that relates over also to those people who focus on anticipations as being images. There's a section in the letter to Herodotus, I think, that Epicurus is talking about present impressions of the mind. There's that phrase out there that seems to be in maybe several places, but present impressions of the mind. Does that mean the mind receiving a present impression of a stimulus that's come from outside, or does it mean the mind having a present impression of its own stimulus from its own memory, or both, or neither?
It could be either way. And I don't think we should pin him to one or the other.
Yeah, I do remember that section in the letter to Herodotus that Epicurus wrote. And I think I also remember a section just after that where the impressions are either understood by the mind, like thinking about them, like the impression that it leaves, like from the influx of images, or constantly seeing that image over and over again until it becomes embedded in memory.
And related to that, Charles, is the section in Velleius about the gods, where the gods are interpreted as analogies to a motion picture film where the images are constantly streaming. And then people relate that to how a stream doesn't have any particular existence, but the movement of its atoms. And then overlaying that is the issue that when Velleius talks about that we perceive the images of the gods, he uses a word that implies that the images are moving from us to the gods as opposed to from the gods to us, is one of the things that I've seen the commentators talk about. So this motion of the atoms in the form of images is a major component of what they're thinking about, and it's very difficult to grasp without more material, but it's clearly there.
Yeah.
Doesn't it's been forever since I've read it, but doesn't part of the wall inscription by Diogenes of Ono and have a section of Epicurus, a letter he wrote to his mother that talks about dreams?
Yes, I think so.
I remember reading that.
So. There's dreams mentioned there. I can't quote the detail or remember even what it said. But
I can't quote it, but
the mention that he mentions it is that the dreams have no meaning for the future. So because apparently there's a misinterpretation that we can tell the future from the dreams, and Epicurus says no, that is not the case.
Yeah, I remember that Vatican saying.
So he's got a theory here that sort of allows us to understand, or I don't want to use the word patronize or sympathize, but it's sort of a mechanism that would explain how people can have inaccurate sensations or inaccurate feelings of experiencing interactions with the gods or whatever. These images, because he clearly talks about it, and when he talks about the accuracy of vision and how vision can be distorted through distance and through maybe fog or something, or water, when you see an ore through water and you think the ore is bent, you've got this phenomena of images coming to you in an inaccurate way. So that just because you receive an image of something, just because you receive an image of a god, does not mean that you've received something that's accurately received.
Right. And you have to put all your senses together, right?
Yes.
You don't just go by one sense. You go by repeated observations and putting your vision and your hearing and everything together. Yeah.
I like that section a lot in Diogenes Laertius about is that a cow or a horse over yonder?
Yeah.
Same issue.
Yeah.
Even though Epicurus is reputed to have said all sensations are true, this is the issue of the multiple meanings of truth, that we may receive the sensation honestly, but not truly accurate to all of the facts.
Well, in that example of seeing the four-legged animal in the distance, our minds aren't lying to us, and neither are our sensations. We see that animal over there, but it's at such a distance that we cannot accurately see it in the same sense of coming to a proper and solid conclusion, and that is when it gets lost in translation.
Well, we can see it, but we're leaping to conclusions so quickly that we don't realize where we've gone astray from our bare perceptions to, deciding what that is. I mean, I had the experience once of walking with a friend along the beach, and we saw this thing in the sand at the edge of the water in the distance, and we thought it was a shark. We both thought it was a shark that had washed up onto the beach. And as we got closer, we saw it was a lawn chair. I would have felt real stupid if it hadn't been for that. My friend thought this. We both thought the same thing at the same time. But what was hitting our eyes, the actual image, wasn't wrong. It was that we both leapt to this conclusion that we were seeing something that wasn't. We filled in stuff, and that wasn't right. So this very last part, I think, is super exciting, because so now he's set up his system where the soul is seeds that are distributed in the body, and then having the body kind of like a vessel, and when the body's really coming apart, can't keep these soul particles in. So if the body can't keep it in, how could the air, which is more subtle than the tissues of the body, how would it even be possible for the soul to remain intact? So which would mean, your soul isn't leaving your body on death as an intact thing. And that's, I guess, where he's going, is the impossibility of the soul being a thing after the body dies. I mean, the details are not right, but just thought process is certainly fascinating to look at.
Because, of course, in the end, this is the payoff the payoff of this is that the soul does not survive after death. It does not go to hell. It does not go to hell to be punished. It does not go to heaven to be rewarded.
Right.
Our life is over at that point. And that conclusion has incredibly profound implications for how we live our lives.
Right. And the conclusion is one that we can still come to, even though the details of how he was thinking about this are not exactly right. So that's pretty cool.
Okay, well, let's begin to draw today's episode to a conclusion. And as usual, we first go to Martin.
Yeah, again, I'm incredibly slow in coming up with a thought and formulating it out. So.
Well, that's the beauty of editing, is you take as long as you like, or we can just move to another person. But nevertheless, take your time if you would like.
Yeah, I think better move. I don't really feel something's coming that soon.
Charles?
Usually I'd have some closing thoughts if I had read the section ahead of time, which I didn't do this time, but I got nothing.
All right, we'll cover it next week if something comes to your mind in the meantime. Elaine?
My overall feeling about this passage is just fascination with the way Epicurus' mind worked and his wide variety of thinking of observing nature and trying to figure out why it was happening. It's kind of exciting to read things produced by that kind of mind. Even where it didn't go right, it's just still really neat.
Yep, it's really enjoyable on many levels and profitable on many levels. Okay, well, we'll call this to a conclusion at this point today, and we'll come back next week. So thanks, everybody, again for your participation, and we'll do it again next week.
All right. Bye.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.